Romans 13, 8 through 12. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up by this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this, understanding the present time, the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light.
Well, good morning, church, and welcome to the month of September. Are you excited that September's here? Some of you are. Are you excited that college football is here?
Yes, sir.
Are you excited that the NFL is kicking off this week?
Yes, sir.
You all are more excited about football than September. Okay, that's all right. Maybe it's because it got really hot again. I don't know. Well, anyway, welcome to September. Welcome to a new month together. And while it is a new month together, we are still in this Roman series. Believe it or not, this is week 11. And so we still even have a couple more weeks after this Sunday to go. And what's incredible is each week that we have been working through Romans has been different, but also just very unique. And so not just different in that as we've built on each chapter, the topics and what we've learned has changed, but it's really been unique. You know, if you were with us from the beginning, you may remember that the very first 2 weeks of this series were taught by our discipleship pastor, Aaron Buchanan. And if you were here for the first week of that, you may remember it was very unique in that he almost fainted. Some of you weren't here for that. And so week 2, there was a stool behind him just to be prepared for that. And so it started out kind of unique in that way. And then week 3, I came in and I heard about that. And so I got nervous of like, okay, is that going to happen to me? I'm not sure. Because I had just come back from a sabbatical. And so I got to tell you a little bit about that. And I picked up where Aaron had left off and the incredible job that he had done in those first 2 weeks. And then after me, Travis picked up the series. And so that's unique in that typically, as our lead pastor, he doesn't usually pick up in week 4 of a series, but he did. And so for the last 7 weeks, he's kind of been walking us through all of those chapters. And really, we've learned so much through all of it. And today is no different. Today will be another day that will be unique. And in some ways, it might even be a little bit different. And I'm really excited for that. But if you've been with us from the beginning, you may also remember that one of the things that we've put up on the screen a few times is kind of how the book of Romans is broken up. That part 1, as we've looked at faith, is the first 8 chapters. And so we were camped out there for quite a while. And part 2 was hope. And we looked at Romans chapters 9 through 11. And so then as we turned a page, so to speak, and got to part 3, really just these last few weeks, we've talked about what it looks like to practice practical righteousness. That as Paul established, okay, this is faith and this is hope, Okay, so then how does that just get carried out in day-to-day life? And so as we've worked through them, there have been some unique challenges each week as well. Aaron taught us a lot about like history and treaties and covenants in the Old Testament and how those give us peace when it comes to what Christ has done for us. One week we did a deep dive into the word baptism and why we do that the way that we do here. One week there was a very deliberate invitation for anybody that had not yet decided to become a follower of Jesus, that at the end of the service to simply come forward. And that's something common that we do, but there was a unique one in that Sunday. It was like, come on, let's do it. And it was a huge part of the message. And in that same Sunday, there was also a challenge for anybody and everybody that was in the audience that was already a believer to think of themselves as a commissioned missionary. And for their perspective to be, okay, when I leave this service today, I need to think about not just in general telling other people about Jesus, but I need to think about a specific person that I am on mission for, and we commissioned you, so to speak. One week, our teaching was noticeably shorter than it usually is. Maybe you were here for that one, where the sermon was only 20 minutes long. And so that was intentional in that we sang more songs than we typically do. And we sang like 5 or 6 songs after the teaching time that day. And so if you were here for that one, maybe you really enjoyed that. We got a lot of incredible feedback from that one. But that was really unique. And so we continue on today. And what you just heard read is the 8th verse of this chapter, which means we skipped the first 7. And that's intentional in that what we're about to look at in verses 1 through 7, it matters in light of what Paul says in verses 8 and beyond. Because what he says in verses 8 and beyond matter to not just verses 1 through 7, but things that he's already said in chapter 12 when it comes to practicing practical righteousness. And so that was intentional. That I picked those verses this morning, because if we don't frame what we're about to learn and read together in light of verses 8 and beyond, I think we'll miss a lot of what Paul wants us to understand. And so let's look at the first 7 verses now together. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right. But for those who do wrong, do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. So give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Pretty straightforward, right? Pretty simple, right? I mean, as I read those verses, there's probably no one here that doesn't completely agree with that, right? None of us struggle to put any of those into practice. Right? Okay, there you go. I'm gonna be honest, these verses make me nervous. Like circling today's date on the calendar and knowing the teaching text that we had, it made me a little nervous. Because in the days that we are living in, you read this and it can be hard. This can be a very surprising passage. I mean, you read this and it seems to demand absolute obedience to the government if you're a follower of Jesus. I mean, what are these verses even about? Well, I think it's important that we point out this is a commandment that runs throughout the New Testament. In Titus chapter 3, Paul said this, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be gentle towards everyone. In 1 Timothy, he said this, I urge then, first of all, that petitions and prayers, intercessions and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior. In 1 Peter, we read, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as a supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so it was the consistent and the official teaching of the early Christian church that everyone should obey, and prayers were to be made for the civil powers. And so the temptation for us today is to read these verses and honestly for us to think to ourselves, well, that was then. This is now. That what Paul wrote in Romans and in Titus and in Timothy and what Peter wrote, that they wouldn't have said those things if they were living where we were living today. If they were experiencing the things that we experience in our culture today. Do you know who was in charge when Paul wrote those words? Do you know who was in charge when Peter wrote what he wrote? Emperor Nero. Do you know who Emperor Nero was? Here's a little history lesson. Nero ruled from about 54 to 68 AD, and he was notorious for his persecution of Christians. Real persecution of Christians. You see, Christians rejected small g gods. And in that day and age in Rome, small g gods were everywhere. There were a lot of little gods. And so Nero didn't like that because Christians rejected little g gods and they believed in monotheism. They believed that there was one God, capital G, and he was the only one that anyone should surrender their lives to. And so in AD 64, Nero had had enough. And so a fire broke out. Rome was on fire. And many people believe Nero himself set the fire, but he used Christians as a scapegoat. He blamed the fire on Christians, and he said they were rebellious, and so thus began an incredible persecution where he would have Christians fight vicious animals. Christians would be crucified. Christians would be lit on fire and used as human torches in his gatherings as he entertained. That just vicious persecution broke out. And so when Paul wrote Romans, it was actually somewhere around AD 55 to 58. And so this persecution that I just spoke of that Nero started in 64 hadn't really begun yet, but Nero was already in power and the Jews didn't like him. And a large portion of them were rebellious. And Paul knew that. And so as he's writing this, it seemed like he could just sense something was happening because especially these Palestinian Jews and around in Galilee, it was just constantly boiling over with insurrection and revolt. The Jews at the time were rebellious. And so Paul, in some way, is trying to correct them before what is going to happen happens. Because there were these Jewish zealots, that a large portion of the Jews were these people that just at any cost were convinced there is no king, there is no emperor except for God. And so we will give no praise, we will give no honor, we will give no respect or even contribution, taxes and revenue to anyone but God. And it wasn't just this belief and conviction that they held inside. It wasn't a passive resistance. It was an active resistance. They believed that the only way that God would help them or honor them is if they engaged in violent actions because of what they believed. And so they spent every single day raising just incredible evil themselves by being civilly disturbant. They would disobey. They would carry daggers. They behaved as terrorists. And not only did they use terrorism towards these Roman officials and the government, they would wreck the houses of and burn the crops and assassinate families of other Jews who were subservient to the government, who followed what the government asked. And so Paul's writing, and he just doesn't understand how anyone that calls themselves a follower of Christ would behave that way. And his tune doesn't change as things get worse. A couple of passages that were already up on the screen, but Titus 3, 1 through 2, and 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 3, you look at these and you look at the instruction that's given here, and be subject to rulers and authorities, be obedient, ready to do what's good, slander no one. I urge you, intercession and thanksgiving for all people, kings and all those in authority, and these that are written. Paul wrote to Titus in AD 63, so 1 year before this incredible persecution breaks out. That Paul has been imprisoned in Rome, and he can sense, something's happening here, something bad. And when he writes to in 1 Timothy to Timothy, it's AD 65. The persecution had already broken out. And so by the time Paul writes 2 Timothy, he is in Rome, imprisoned again, and it wouldn't be long before Paul himself was executed. And so when I read these verses, it's clear to me that being a good earthly citizen and being a follower of Jesus, they go together. You cannot separate them. It's not an option, even when it's hard, when it's really hard, which is where I think we have to begin today if we're truly going to apply this in our context of where we are. And I think it's also so important that I point out the fact that we are not the only ones that read Romans 13. This Bible that we have, this is not the American Bible. This Bible spans the globe. It is not just for us in an extraordinary state, in an extraordinary country. Which means if Romans is your favorite passage of Scripture, or maybe it's a Galatians, or maybe it's Psalms, or maybe it's Proverbs, or whatever the book is, it's somebody else's too, on the other side of the world right now. And as extraordinary as our government system is in this country, not every country has the same type of government. And so when they read this, they may be called to submit to a dictator. They may be called to submit to someone that this very day is potentially going to break down their door and kill their entire family because they cannot even practice their religion in their country without hiding in a cave. Our brothers and sisters read this verse and they too wrestle with it. And so I think it's important that we do too. So let's break up what Paul says. 13, 1 through 2, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, so consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Everyone. Again, Paul is writing this to an audience who was prone to rebellion and rejection, that they were rejecting earthly authorities over them, and Paul's going, you need a course correction. The earthly authorities then, Nero, and still today, and you fill in the blank when you think of who your Nero is. It's been established by God. God appoints a nation's leaders, Paul says. And it's not always to bless people. Sometimes leaders are in place to judge people. Maybe it's to ripen a nation for judgment. Maybe it's to refine them. And you see that throughout the Bible, you see that throughout history. And so regardless of where you live and who the human is that is in charge, God's in control, okay? And you and I are called to submit whom he has allowed to lead. And so regardless of how temporary or regardless of how permanent someone's tenure is, Paul says everyone must, not some, not you can if you feel like it. Paul makes it clear that every authority that exists has been established, and as hard as it is to comprehend that it has been established by God, and so to rebel or to reject those authorities means you are rejecting what God has put in place. And so then he outlines how someone that follows Jesus can be at peace in this. He says, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So Paul's idea here is that Christians should be the best citizens of all. That even though they are loyal to God, before they're loyal to the state, hear me say that. You're loyal to God before you're loyal to the state, that Christians are still called to be good citizens because they are honest. They give no trouble to the state. They pay their taxes, and most importantly, they pray for the state, the governors and the rulers. And in these verses, Paul goes as far as to describe government officials as God's servants. He uses that phrase that they have a role in this plan and administration of what God is up to. They're not the ultimate authority, but they are servants to God as the ultimate authority. They have been given legitimate authority to hold people accountable for wrongdoing, so we should strive to be law-abiding citizens. And then Paul says this, therefore, it's necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but as a matter of conscience. This is why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So again, those that are in authority are God's servants. We're not submitting to them purely out of fear, but Paul says, do this also out of a good conscience, that you and I are responding to their positions with a discerning spirit that causes us to give them what their position is owed. Look at verse 7 one more time. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. What do we owe? What are we to give? Submission, respect, honor, intercession. What would happen if more than ever before we as a church began to live out what those first 7 verses say? What if we became known for that? What would happen if we as a church and as individuals began praying for our elected officials multiple times a day and we full on committed to that? What if we would do that? What if that's how we started our day? What if that's what we did as a part of our lunch break? What if that's what we did as a family when we gathered around our dinner table? And what if that was a part of our prayers as we were tucking our kids into bed, or we were saying a prayer by ourselves before we went to bed? What would our conversation start or stop sounding like? What if you and I stopped watching and listening or just simply giving so much attention to news outlets that long ago have drawn a line in the sand and decided this person's bad and this person's good, and that's the way it is? One of my favorite characters in the entire Old Testament is a guy named Daniel. We meet Daniel as a young man who he's an Israelite and he's been carried into captivity. And he himself has gone, but he's been joined by 3 of his friends, commonly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so Daniel and these other 3 are carried in, and King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon at the time, is just really just trying to rule the world. And so as a part of bringing these guys in, he's bringing in these best young specimens that would be wise and that he can use for his kingdom and his good. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this dream really disturbs him. And so he calls in some of his officials, and then he says, I need somebody to figure out what's going on here. And so he brings in some of his own people, and he says, I've had a dream, and I want you to not only tell me what the dream means, I want you to tell me what I dreamt. I need you to tell me the dream. And they look at him and they say, that's impossible. We can't do that. Why don't you tell us what you dreamed, and then we'll tell you what it means? And he says, no, you're trying to trick me. If you're so smart and you're so in tune with the little g gods, you'll be able to tell me what my dream was, and then you'll tell me what it means. And they say, that's impossible. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do then. I'm going to kill all of you. Anybody that's supposed to be wise and an interpreter of dreams and guide me in that way, I'm going to kill all of you. I don't like that you won't tell me what I dreamt. And so the word spreads, kill all these astrologers, kill all of these dream interpreters, kill all the wise men. And that included Daniel and his friends. And so we pick up the story in Daniel chapter 2. It says, Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon. Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. Maybe if you have a Bible or a device, maybe just even underline those 2 words. He spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And Arioch explained the matter to Daniel. He said, this is what happened. At this, Daniel went in to the king, and he asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. This is a side note. You don't get to just demand an audience with a king without being respected. You don't get an audience with the ruler without having positioned yourself in a way where they respect you and they listen. Keep that in mind. Daniel went in. He asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. And Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's their real names. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And then Daniel praised God and said this, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells in him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what was asked of you, what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. And then Daniel went and told the king. Look at how he responded to the authority that was over him. With grace, respect, and tact, and wisdom, and fervent prayer. He said, I'm going to get on my knees and I'm going to involve other people that I know and also follow the big G God. And we are going to surrender everything we have. Our very lives are at stake right now. We better come to God on this. And do you know what it yielded? Daniel got a promotion. He went into the king, and the king was so amazed that Daniel's life was spared, his friends' lives were spared, and he got promoted. And yet, if you kept reading Daniel chapter 2 and beyond, you know what happens next? Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant statue and says, bow down to it or else I'll kill you. They were right back where they started. It just didn't make sense. And you know what they had to do that time? Sorry, king. We don't bow to a small K king. And that outcome was different for them. And yet their lives were spared again because they followed the true king. And so I said this morning was going to be unique. And here's how it is going to be unique. I want to give us some time to pray. And not just for 30 seconds, we're going to pause. We are going to dedicate 5 minutes, which in the grand scheme of things, if you think about it, that's not a long time. But it's going to feel like a long time. Because it will be quiet, mostly. And you'll receive a few prayer prompts. There will be 3 different things that will come up on the screen. And each one will be up there for about 1.5 minutes. And then I will close this in prayer about 5 minutes from now. But I want to point something out about these before they even come up. The first one is more of a corporate prayer. The first one is more we, us. And then it gets really personal because it moves to I. And the invitation will be to look at these and to read through them and to pray them for yourself, but then to spend the rest of the time before the next prompt comes up wrestling with what you read and adding to it and maybe even paying attention to what you wrestle with. Because I'm going to be honest, the things that are going to come up on the screen are hard. They're difficult. They're challenging, but they're true. They matter. And it is important that we become committed to being people that honor our King Jesus. So let's begin. Father, I ask that you help us to respect and to give honor to those who lead our nation. Father, help us, as your church, be the model of honor towards those that you have appointed. Father, especially those with whom we disagree with. Father, mold our hearts to truly love them, even if they are evil. Father, you tell us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us, and so we trust you. May we trust you evermore as the righteous ruler over everyone. Father, I ask that you bless and guide those that are in authority over us. Use us as witnesses to your goodness and mercy. Amen. So that's the first 7 verses. But what about the rest? How are they related? I said that at the beginning, that it was important that we started in verse 8. Look back at our stage reading. Look at verse 8, how it opens. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Christianity is not only a call to fulfill our duty as earthly citizens, it is a call to fulfill our duty as heavenly citizens. And the same concept of paying what is owed is used. We're to keep paying a debt that will never be settled, the debt of loving one another. And so when we do that, everything falls into place. That if you and I are living to every single day settle the debt of loving one another, we'll keep the rest of the commandments, Paul says. That we won't commit adultery because we will lead our lives with respect and restraint. That we won't murder because love never seeks to destroy, but instead to build up. And so we will seek to destroy our enemies not by killing them, but by seeking to make friends of them. We won't steal, for love is always more concerned with giving than getting. We won't covet because true love cleanses us and our hearts of the desires for that which is forbidden. St. Augustine, a famous theologian, a long time ago said this: love God and do what you like. And he was on to something there. To think about this, just love God and then do what you like. That if you love God with all your heart, the greatest commandment, it will guide you in your entire life, and you will lead the life that you're called to lead. In other words, if our lives are dominated by a genuine love for God and love for other people, we don't ever have to worry. We will be marked by service to King Jesus. And this type of living is important because Paul alludes to this idea that Jesus could come back at any time. Those first followers legitimately thought that it would be in their lifetime. I mean, you turn to the book of Acts and you see one of the very first interactions. The disciples have just been with Jesus and he gave them the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go and make disciples. And then he is taken into heaven. And the book of Acts opens with them looking and just watching. Some of them probably thought, okay, tonight he's coming right back down. The early church really thought this will be in our lifetime. And so Paul wrote that in verses 11 and 12. He said, do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber. Our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. Let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. And so the call here, the urgency here is be vigilant, be ready to be fully awake to the reality. This world is not your home. In this broken and fallen place that we currently reside in, we are called to love fiercely, to give honor and respect to those who are in authority, while also recognizing that God is fully in control. He has been, he is currently, and he always will be. And so with that, I think it's so important that we understand that's a big reason we gather in this place on Sunday mornings. This gathering is so vital because when we come into this place, we are reminding ourselves of who is on the throne. That it's not us. It's not our favorite news source. It's not a politician that we think if they could just be in power, then everything would be exactly as it could or should be. It's not a relationship. It's not an accolade. It's not anything that you and I are chasing, that if we could get it, then everything would be perfect. No, it is God and God alone who reigns supreme. And walking in that reality is the only way to live. That's why when we gather, we sing songs about him. That's why we pause and we pray to the creator of the universe. That's why we look at this book, we open it, and we say, this is true, this is how we should live. It's why we take communion together and remember the sacrifice of Jesus. Everything we do in this gathering reminds us of those things. These are things that people of a heavenly kingdom remind themselves of, meaning this world is not our home, and so may you and I become incredible citizens of his kingdom every day. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this morning. Father, I thank you for a text like this. That's difficult, that was written so long ago, but written for us today, written for people 200 years before us. And Father, if you so desire, written for people 200 years from now. Father, may we find ourselves continuing to grow in our understanding of how you have called us to live. And Father, may we also find ourselves incredibly ready to be reunited with you. That we would find ourselves as people that want to be in your kingdom. That as we live here, your kingdom will be done as it already is with you. And we would long for the day to be reunited. It's in your name I pray. Amen.